All right, everyone. Well, welcome back to our February Next Level Coaching series session. And today we're going to tackle the topic of managing through the grind of a long season. On our in the last couple of sessions, we've talked about maximizing a winter break, coming back from a break, and kind of whether you're in the middle of your winter season, how do you capitalize from that? If you're starting your spring season, how are you ramping up for that? But we're in this interesting time right now where me, as a lacrosse guy, games already started end of January, early February, and there's teams that had top, 10 aspirations that are 0 and 3. There's, basketball teams that are, not even going to sniff the conference playoffs for whether high school or college. Um, different sports that you're in, different times of the season, it can be a tough thing when it starts, everyone's got championship aspirations, right? You feel like you've done what you can do to prepare your team, to prepare yourself. And when things aren't going the right way, it can be tough to manage through that. So that's what we're going to talk about today, or at least start talking about today, is how do you manage through that long season? How do you deal with the adversity or when things aren't going the way they want to go? Now, Bob, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, and maybe let's go a little bit off script a little bit. You run races, right? Or you have in the past Ironman marathon, like so. I think this applies the themes. I know you and I've talked about this before. You start a race and it doesn't go the way it's supposed to go. Um, you're still going to finish that race. You're still going to try to finish that race. If you're running a marathon and you're behind pace on mile 4, and I can be like, well, that's it, right? Kind of what goes into your thought process in using kind of that metaphor on like you're going to finish that race because that's what you set out to do. And what have you learned from that you think could be applicable for coaches and
Great.
athletes?
Yeah, great question. Thanks a lot. I appreciate being able to be back. Sorry I missed last month, but the first thing that comes to mind is respect the game.
Mm,
And in the years that I've competed, and mostly solo stuff in triathlon, but I was a three-sport athlete, but in high school, never played at the college level. But I would say if there are people listening to this, is also don't compromise the culture. If it's a team and a team environment, let's not get away from the things that we want to transcend every season. But getting back to the how I handled it, an experience comes to mind in my very last Ironman, which is in 2019, and I went in. I wasn't as good a shape as I thought I'd be, and I was dealing with some injury, and I swam 2.4 miles, biked 112, and I ran walked 13, and I'm coming through town getting ready to start the second loop, and there's my family.
mm,
And I just stopped briefly and I said, I'm going to be a while, but I'm coming off this course one of two ways, either on a stretcher or across the finish line, right? Because we're not going to give up. And we might, and that was hey, in that race, I guess that day I was 3-10, so to speak, if you equate it to a team sport. But I wasn't going to disrespect the game, and I wasn't going to forget why I showed up because people are watching. And if you're
mm.
team sports and you're doing things, parents are watching, other prospective players are watching, and they're watching how you not only win, but they're watching more importantly how you handle when things get tough. So I would say just respect the game, maintain that culture. Yeah, think forward, but don't sit that last year player on the bench because hey, we're 0-13. I'm going to get the freshman in. So,
Yeah, such a good point. Something that you said that I just want to like highlight or spotlight, maybe I'll like summarize, say a little bit differently is like, I feel like, culture is built in the tough moments.
right.
And like, it's easy to be happy when you're winning and everything is going right, right? Like um, no one you learn more from tough times than you do from good times, right? You can still learn, but I feel like the lessons always come out of the challenges, or more lessons come out of the challenges. I mean, we were chit-chatting before we hit record around the Eagles winning the Super Bowl. And there's a lot of, Jalen Hurts discussion around the lessons he learned the last time he lost to the Chiefs and how that motivated him and him like, taking some of that confetti, right, and then turning that into energy. Um, you don't lose there, maybe you don't win now, right? You don't get there. So it's an interesting concept about what you can learn when things aren't going great, and um, and I'm in the moment, right? But that's the thing too, Bob, and maybe you can expand on this, and then like to hear Amit's and Martin's thoughts. Like in the moment, for you to have the mental wherewithal and even say those words out loud to your family, like I may be a while, but I'm finishing, right? There was a internal resolve to say I'm not quitting. And like I may not finish, but it's going to be because I'm physically unable to finish. I'm not going to tap out. So, I mean, I imagine that's like routine reps of mental toughness. Like that doesn't happen by accident. And so, tell me more about where you think that comes from and how that's been that endurance, mental endurance muscle has been strengthened over time.
I think it's for me it was born of having done the work, right? I knew I did the work to be able to
Mm,
be there that day, and you know what? Things just didn't go my way, and that's okay. And those are defining moments. I call them moments of truth,
mm,
right? Winning takes care of a lot of things. Like, hey, when the basketball team or the football team is 15-0, the kid sitting at the end of the bench is not complaining about playing time. He's having a blast, right? But 0-15, and everybody's like, hey, coach, maybe I'll be getting a few more minutes. So, but for me, that mental toughness and resilience and was always, I don't know, maybe it was a little bit of a chip on the shoulder too, where I always felt like I had to work a little harder than that other guy. And no matter what happens out here in the race course today, you might be faster, you might have a shinier bike, and you might have had a better training lead up, but you are not going to outwork me. And that's how I went at it. So it reminds me of a quote I always remember from my freshman basketball coach. He said, I don't care what your name is, whether it's Turner or so and so and so and so. I don't care what you did last year. I want to be better at the end of the year than we are today. So it's all about continuous improvement all the time. And I think when that long season comes into play and you're like, man, how do we get some value out of this? Let's just improve every single day. And let's move the needle in whatever way we can, even though we're dealing with a lot of adversity.
love that. Now, Martin, you've coached many teams, and I'm sure you've coached great ones that ever had a high level success, but I'm sure there's been some ones that have been not where you wanted them to be. So how, explain that process to it. Is it something, well, tell me your thoughts on it. Like, what are you feeling and doing when you're in the midst of it and things aren't going your way?
I really like what Bob said about respecting the game. And you can also put that into respecting the process of success, and that it is a long, long journey. And, it's a unique individual journey for that team, and also for those athletes, and also for those coaches. I think that those like pieces get all wrapped up into one, when really they are individual journeys that go into it. So Bob, I really liked your respecting the game, because when you do that, it pays off, and you can accept what the payoff is. I know the four of us, are very familiar with the problem, the process, the payoff, and what that payoff is. And when there is that respect and there is that process, the payoff could be a loss, could be a sub season that you didn't expect, could be a time in a race that was not to your liking, but you can accept that payoff when you're committed and respecting the process that goes into that. And I think that's so important when you're thinking about the winning teams and the teams that have not achieved the success that they want, or that the outside entities, are looking for. What comes to mind, John, I may or may not be answering the question, but what comes to mind is breaking it down to that process. Because whether, like, it's very easy to be like, oh, well, when it's winning, everything's easy. Living here in Philadelphia and having, a member of the Eagles in our household, like, it's not easy. Like, they just played 22 games. Like, that is a very long season to keep your ducks in a row, to keep all your ships facing the right direction, I mean, whatever you want to say. Does it look more glamorous than a team that's, 2-16? Absolutely. Are the challenges different? Absolutely. But let's not act like there are no challenges when you're winning. We're all familiar with the concept of seduction of success, and certainly, at the high school level and the college level and the pro level, there are immaturities that creep up into any situation, but keeping the main thing, I mean, that's very cliche to say, but keeping the team goals above the individual goals. And John, you mentioned Saquon Barkley, prior to us starting today. I mean, that he's one example that's very open about it and talks to the media very openly about, yes, I could get that record, but the ultimate goal is to win a Super Bowl. So actually, if coach doesn't want to play me, I'm cool with that. Like, that takes a certain level of respecting the game and respecting your teammates and what the main goal is, to take yourself and take a step back. But, to me, I think it's the process and being invested in the process at each step for each person. If it's not ideal, if you lose the game, if you have a sub 500 or a sub whatever season, you're able to pick yourself up and go on to the next one when you're committed to the process and knowing that you're in it for the long haul and you're in it for the incremental wins, the small wins, the mindset wins, the increase in strength or the decrease in weight, depending on what your sport is, right? Like, those are all parts of the process that, like, athletes today, pros, high school, college, they're all of the generation of like instant gratification, right? Like, I can get anything I want on Google, on Instagram, on TikTok. Like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to make that. Let me just Google it. Let me TikTok it. I can figure it out. Like, I'll get a YouTube video in 5 seconds on how to plug my tire, or, I mean, whatever it is. So the concept of respecting the game, of being in it for the process, is really hard for these people because it's very counter to what society is telling us. I just think that's a very interesting, like, dynamic to kind of sit in, but so important to remember when you're not having the season that you want, or you are having the season that you want, and it just keeps going. And you just have to keep the group together for one more week. Like, it sounds great and glorious. Like, don't get me wrong, but it's hard. Like, that is hard as well, to keep everybody I don't want to say distraction free, that's not realistic, but with minimal distractions and keeping your eyes in the boat, as they say, to keep it moving. And that's where the challenge comes in, right, John? Like, that's where the challenge with coaches, with athletes, with a team, that's where all of that comes in. And I mean, I know you love to talk about accountability. And that's where the personal accountability to the mission, to respecting the game or whatnot, comes in. So maybe that's a segue into how the individuals kind of keep it together for the betterment of the group, whether you're winning or losing.
Thank you, Martin, for that segue. And John, I want to say this, that, we talk about respecting the game, respecting the process. Just a quick story. I'm in my 26th season of my business, and I'll be very honest with you. On year one, I really tried to make it a point to say, I'm just going to go through year one. I never imagined year 24 to 26. Looking back on that, year one through, God knows, year 5 was not pretty. But I really thought about maybe year 2 will be better, maybe year 3, and you just sort of focus on that year, and it's all a big picture mentality that we all mentioned that. Like, what is the goal here? Is my goal to win one ring? Is my goal to win one Super Bowl, one NBA championship? Or do I want to build a system? If you build a system, it'll sustain over time. So I think really respecting the game also comes down to just having a long-term goal and taking that year by year, or in our case, season by season, and realizing, yeah, it may not have worked out the way I wanted to, but let's implement a few changes. And then we go back to, like Mara, you just mentioned about accountability, and say, okay, if things didn't work out the way I wanted to, what changes can I make? And also vice versa, if things did work out, what changes can I make also so I can grow it and build on that? I think winning and losing really comes down to is building that system and having a bigger vision, whether you're victorious or not. There's some seasons where you do win and you want to celebrate, nothing wrong with that. But I feel like at the end of the day, also has to look at it and say everybody else is working just as hard as you are in the following season, right? Like Philly to go back next year. Well, guess what? There's quite a few teams in the NFC now that are coming after them. It's a fact, right? Both AFC and NFC. And not to get into football again, but the Chiefs are hungry. I mean, they want to come back and the way they performed a few nights ago. So just between in looking at the whole picture, I think it's just keeping that big picture of what is that? What are our goals, and work day by day to really implement them and move from there.
I bet you said like the accountability piece, and it jogged my thought of like, what is your role in this? Like what did you do that impacted the outcome negatively or positively, right? You want to tweak and change and polish and upgrade the things that you did that did not lead to the outcome. But the things that did lead to the outcome that you wanted, again, what's your role in that? Where did you go above and beyond, or where did you not? Like, what is your role in all of this? I think when we think about that, that also helps the duration of the season. Like, what is my role in this last week? How did I impact the outcome? What changes need to be made, or what do I need to keep doing? I didn't realize that that little conversation impacted that athlete in such a profound way. I need to make sure that I check in with that athlete again next week. That was really impactful. I didn't think it was a big deal, but the athlete did. Great. Like, what is my role? Brings it from this laborious, long, monumental uphill battle to a much smaller bite size year one, week one, wherever you are in the process, mile one, week 2 of training for a competitive race.
And I think that's where it's super important to break things down. And we've talked about this throughout the first webinar that we did, and then now with the subsequent series that we've been doing. As we're, I think of it as an entrepreneur in business, and Amit, you just brought that up. It's the same thing, right? It's like, it's like that 0 to 1 mentality, or like, I forget whether it was, Bezos or who we talked about kind of this. It's always day one, kind of that startup, like, and there's a lot that I think, when I started kind of fusing business and athletic coaching, that's when things really started to spark. Like, oh, I like all this stuff works on both sides, and it's more tangible to see it. And well, not necessarily, because like if you're making money, there's your outcome, right? Like your business is successful if you're winning games, but so it's just as tangible, I think, on either side. But breaking it down, it's why people like to do, months and quarters and weeks. Like you get down to like, what are the measurable inputs and outputs that are going to ultimately create the success that I want to see? With the athletes that I've been working with this season, that for the lacrosse season it just started, we really grasped the 1% better concept. There's this great story about the British cycling team in the early 2000s, and they're 1% better. They focused on better pillows, no dirt in their trailers. So they painted them white so they could see any speck of dirt, and just making compounding interest on 1% increments. And so when I first introduced the concept, people were like, oh yeah, good. Just like I'm gonna have today's practice is gonna be better than yesterday. And I challenged them to say, well, how is today's practice going to be better? What are you going to work on today? Shooting. No. What about shooting? We're talking 1%. I want you to work on the way you place your hands on your stick when you're dodging to the left. I want that level of intentional focus. That's what you're focused on today. In every drill, it's hand placement. And that's all I want you to care about today. Then tomorrow, you work on this thing, and then because now you got the hand placement down, so you don't get to think about that, right? So now it's hand placement plus this. Now it's hand placement plus this plus that, right? And so, I'm doing the same thing. And these are college athletes. Martin, you'd be very proud. My daughter scored her first BAA basketball point last night in the 38-8 victory over Prior Lake. It's a big win for us, first win of the season. But it was she's playing basketball for the first time. And so I'm like, don't worry about Caitlin Clark and all that stuff. You like, you can't do that yet. Don't worry about it. That's fine. Aspire to that. But all I want you to do is to be able to pull the ball through. Because right now, when they close out on you, you don't know what to do. So we're just worrying about pulling the ball through. So don't even worry about shooting yet. Like you'll get to that. I just want you bringing the ball down, pulling through, and having a sit right. And so, that stuff all stacks on each other. But Martin, to your point, you couldn't be more true. Like you see, we're a 15-second TikTok highlight generation, consumption generation now. It is what it is, right? So you see the best of everything and you aspire to that, and you're like, what's my hack to get there? Like hard work is the hack. Like you can't, nobody gets there with longevity and sustainment, which is what we're talking about, without going through the work. Like you can maybe catch lightning in a bottle, but that's not going to get you to 26 seasons like you got, Amit. That might get you through one, might get you one title or two titles, but it's not going to get you the longevity that I think most people aspire to. They don't want to just be a flash in the pan. They want to do something great and leave a legacy and have impact.
I also think, John, you mentioned something very interesting, and Martin, you mentioned this too, is about business and coaching. Because there's people involved. That's a similarity. And what you bring affects everyone else around you, whether it's your energy or whether it's your thought process. So if you don't believe in yourself and your year, how will anybody else believe in yourself and your
Yeah.
team, right? Because we're all leading teams. Even in individual sports, there's a team. Like it's interesting how people call certain sports individual sports. Well, there's still a team involved. You just don't see the team. I feel like those actions that you take, they affect everyone else around you, and that matters. And John, you mentioned details, how important details are. I was just reading a book last night about a restaurant owner, and he was talking about the details of when he puts plates on the table. The logos have to be the right side up. The actual, the client may not notice that, but the restaurant owners and the waiters know that the logos have to have a certain way. But those details matter, whether it's business or teams, and it's just a great point that you follow details, you pay attention to details that affects your team, your camaraderie around you and how they function.
It's one of my favorite things I do with my youth athletes. 10, I mean, these are 8, 9, 10-year olds. First thing I installed 3 years ago when I took over this youth program, when you show up to practice, everything's in your bag and everything's lined up. Because if you're going to pay attention to that, then I know you're going to pay attention to the things we do on the field. So if you come in, because first practice stuff's, I mean, and I know what my 8-year-old son's bedroom looks like, so I'm not surprised by that. But it was like, if I can get you to just know when you show up, you get your stuff on, you zip up your bag, you put it over there, and now you're locked in, right? And a lot of it is about creating these like intentional transition points too, around where you can instill what I call simple discipline, right? Like if you can start building the simple discipline around things that quote unquote don't matter, like who is like Coach Saban and Coach Kirby. There's this great like highlight video about them harping on guys for tucking in their shirt, needing to tuck their shirts in, and it's not about the shirts. It's about the discipline to remember the small things. There's like wonderful quote in John Wooden's book around him every year teaching young men how to put their socks on and tie their shoes. And it's kind of tongue in cheek, but he's like if they don't do it right, then they're gonna get blisters and they're gonna be out. I mean, the shoe they weren't these like $300, they were wearing Chuck Taylors that couldn't have been comfortable. So he was like, you do it this way. I've been doing this long enough. It's gonna take care of your feet. Just listen to me. And I want to make sure you do it right. And then if you'll pay attention to the small detail, I know that you'll then pay attention to the big stuff when we need to. And that's something that I think is interesting and again like applicable and again harder if you don't build that when you're 3 and 10, then it's hard to get to 10 and 3 and uh and if you do, it probably won't last long because in those tough moments, right? Like that's when you're not going to be able to get, I think, people's attention, focus, and discipline because they're not used to it. You haven't built that as part of your culture. Like, you mentioned that early on, Bob, but like I think like culture is built in the tough moments. So to shift gears a little bit, this concept that I've been tooling with recently, discomfort versus destruction. And it was inspired by an Ed Milet podcast that I listened to recently about failure. But for me, it came through, like, I've always talked about growth happening during the uncomfortable moments. Time under tension equals growth and opportunity. But what this got me thinking about was that inflection point of when, if you let discomfort turn into destruction. Those are, slumps, losing streaks, right? When one bad play turns into a bad game, multiple bad games. Um, and so kind of taking this down to more of a micro level around how we learn, how we manage through the discomfort, but also, like, make sure it doesn't turn into destruction, meaning that you just go, slide down this death spiral of mental woe. And so maybe Bob, kick it over to you. Like, what are your thoughts on that concept? And we'll apply it here more into the athlete realm or coaches realm, but just, generally speaking, how do you feel about that?
Well, the words progressive overload come to mind, right? And I have a friend of mine that every year he'll text me about this time of year and say, "Hey, I'm going to do an Ironman this year," and I'm like, "No, you're not." He's like, "I'm going to do it off the couch." No, you're not. We're not going to do it off the couch, right? We need to have that progressive overload so we don't have that destruction. Yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. We're going to have to get uncomfortable. But we also need to be clear about what our why is. Like, why are we doing this? Because have you ever been, I don't know, I go back to my stuff and the coaches make us run hills, right? Coach, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? You guys are going to thank me later. Run, and now they call them wind sprints, right? We had to run the wind sprints, and oh man, and they were watching who's going to touch the line, right? And that's how you found out uh, who you're dealing with as an athlete. And for me, it was whether or not I looked up to the coach. And I never respected the guys that just were looking to destroy us and just tear us down. I didn't think that was effective. I wanted that progressive overload stuff, because then we had that. If you take that approach as a coach, a leader, strategist, you get the buy-in and you get trust. And Myron, you know this. If your players don't trust you and know that you're not going to drive them past the point of destruction, then you don't have anything going on. So you have to, back to your point, process oriented. Okay, when I laid out a training plan for my big races, it was something to do every single day. And as you guys, I don't have to tell you, each day got a little bit tougher, but then we build on that, and then we have a build week and a rest recovery week, a deload week, if you will, and those kinds of things. But somebody's got to be driving the bus, and it can't be ego driven. Okay, it's got to be performance and process driven, so that we're just not getting destroyed along the way. No argument, John. Growth happens in discomfort, right? That's where the money's made. But we have to be careful not to be teetering on the edge of destruction all the time.
No, good point. And I think part of it too is that you mentioned it. I mean, we're all kind of, I think, from the same generation of our upbringing as far as like youth athletics, right? And
True.
there was a different approach often. I wouldn't say I tell a great story. I work with the Positive Coaching Alliance, and um I do some of their seminars, and I tell a great story about I'm training young youth coaches. A lot of them moms and dads, volunteers. Hey, we're just out here, right? And you do what you experienced oftentimes, which is why I believe in the mission of PCA so much, because we want to kind of break this cycle of destructive coaching where you're just like, do as I say, don't do it, then I yell at you, right? And it's kind of that. And I have these two coaches that I worked with when I was, between 8 and 10 years old. One was my first football coach, Coach Mike. All I remember about him, that he was mean as hell, and he drove a red pickup truck. And the first time I ever interacted with him during a game, when I made a mistake, he grabbed me by my face mask, screamed at me, said, "Don't ever effing do that again." And the rest of my tenure under him for, Catholic Youth Organization football in Wheaton, Maryland, was don't get yelled at by Coach Mike, right? That's all I cared about. So that's leading with fear. That's like just being afraid. Like, the discomfort was so much that I was just like running away from it. Now I had Coach Brewster, who was my friend's dad, who coached me in baseball. And I was kind of a chubby, unathletic little guy. And I was like, couldn't throw well, couldn't bat very well. And he's like, do you want to play? No one else wanted to play catcher. And since I played football, I had the equipment. I wasn't afraid of getting hit. So I was like, sure, I'll play catcher. He goes, oh, you remind me of Yogi Berra. And I'm like, I have no idea who Yogi Berra is. So I go home and ask my dad, Coach Bruce said I look like Yogi, I looked like I was this chubby little kid too. So maybe there was more of a physical resemblance than there was an athletic resemblance. But he said, hey, he says, I remind him of Yogi Berra. And he kind of chuckles at me. And he, back then he pulls out the old Britannica encyclopedia and he goes, this is Yogi Berra, one of the best, catchers and Yankees that ever lived. Now I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, so I didn't like the Yankee representation, but they're like, oh my God, he thinks I could be great. That amazes me and excites me. And here I am at 43 years old with these two dynamically opposed, but both very burnt in the retina of my not just athletic experience, but my human experience. And diametrically opposed. One saying like, hey, if you show an ounce of belief in somebody, the discomfort of being behind the plate, of doing something that I wasn't good at until I got a little bit better, was way more palatable in baseball than it was in football when I had a coach who I was just trying not to get yelled at. Belief versus admonishment, right? And so, I think that's part of it too, of like staying away from discomfort and not really getting better because I was just wanting not to get yelled at versus seeking and pushing through. So destruction versus discomfort and growth. And that's 8, 10 years old. So I think if, I had no, I wasn't sitting there diagnosing that and doing it like I am now, but I share that with coaches to say that, like, I'm talking about this 35 years later. So this is the kind of impact that you can have as a coach, good or otherwise. This is kind of the what's being bestowed on us as leaders of young people and athletes is the kind of impact we can have.
I think, John, you bring up a great, well, Martin, go ahead, please. You John, you bring up a great point with discomfort and destruction. With discomfort, also, it's important to realize that there's a beginning and there's an end. And if you get through the end, you bust to the other side. If you get to the other side, you have now raised your threshold for future discomfort to come, because it will. But if you haven't done that work, discomfort will go into destruction. It's almost like just knowing that this is temporary, yes, and there's a beginning, there's an end. I think a lot of times if we end up sitting in that discomfort, it goes the opposite way in destruction, versus knowing that, look, I'm gonna get through this. There is another side of this, and when I bust through the other side, all of a sudden now my threshold has gone way up.
I think that's a huge distinction of where does one start, where does one end, where does discomfort end, and then it transitions into destruction. And the concept that I then think of is the team, not necessarily the team players, but it's so apparent. I was listening to a podcast and Gabby Thomas, the Olympian, was on it, and she was saying the question was, as you are running down the straightaway, like, what are you thinking? And she says, I'm thinking of my physio. I'm thinking of my doctors. I'm thinking of the people that stretch me. I'm thinking of my nutrition coach. I'm thinking of, she's listing off in an individual sport. I'm thinking of my teammates who are standing there next to me cheering. Like, in an individual sport, she listed, 5 or 7 or 10 individuals that are on her team. So when we go from the concept of discomfort to destruction, it's the awareness that the team, the assistant coaches, the administration, the captains, that others have a pulse on what's going on and where is the mental state or the emotional state, depending on who the athlete is, because that fine line of discomfort, that the box is just a little bit outside of your stretch, right? Like, you can go to that, but it's destruction when you reach and fall over the cliff because it's too far away. You've crossed that line. And that line's always moving. As we're growing, it's always moving. You find a new threshold. So it's the awareness and the ability of the team members, not necessarily the other athletes, but the team members, to check in and be like, hey, I think we're in a good discomfort right now. We have to stay right here. Lowering that time, asking for 4 more reps, keeping them here 30 more minutes. is going to turn to destruction? What have we accomplished in this box of discomfort right now that we can grow? Period.
It's that law of diminishing returns, right, Mark? It's like there's a certain point where I'm always interested in I'm going to butcher the concept. I don't remember what it is. It's like minimum viable reps in like working out, right? It's like anything like you look at some works out, be like, doing 21 reps on 3 sets. And it's like, well, anything after 15 is just useless because and again, I am no doctor, so I don't know this to be true. I'm just using it as an example to say there was always some point in time, right, where like whatever you're doing, there's some point of where it's a point of diminishing return where anything you do after that isn't going to add value. And again, when we look at it in this concept of like, I always like, one of my favorite movies is Miracle. It's Olympic U.S. hockey movie for those who aren't familiar with it. Just it's a fantastic movie. Living in Minnesota too, there's a lot of like tie-ins with it. But there's this kind of famous or infamous scene where the coach has these young men doing basically sprints on ice, right? They're doing down and backs, and um, so you can look at this in 2 ways. You can look at it as like, is this the point of diminishing return where he's just doing this to be a jerk? But there's this breakthrough point that happens where he was doing it to turn them into a team. Like that. So in this inflection point in this story, he's getting them to go from individuals to a team. And again, we're kind of mixing some messages here because he was like, there's a couple of points where he's like, well, if they hate me, they can't hate each other. So to go like way deeper, these are college hockey players from the 80s, from University of Minnesota and out east and like Boston schools who played against each other in college and hated each other, who have to come together and play on an Olympic hockey team and try to beat the Russians. So a lot of subcontext to it, but that was his thing, is like, I need them to come together. This is how I'm going to get them to come together. But as soon as that took place, he didn't make them run another one just for fun or skate another one. He was like, hit my point, got him, let's go. And so, there's always that point where it's like, have I gotten the thing I'm looking for? And we've talked about this a little bit. We've hinted at it around having a plan or a blueprint or a journey for your season so that like, am I close to the thing I wanted to be at now? Whether it's preseason, postseason, we talked about the Super Bowl, Philly goes like the rest of the team, the administration, like they go right back to work today. They're focused on what you win a championship and it's right back to work. Like you're right back there figuring out what, there's people looking at, salary caps and free agents and all that stuff. I mean, the new season starts in March. So you can't rest on, your laurels too long. And whether that's just winning a game yesterday, you got a new game tomorrow, right? Depending if you're in the middle of your season, you lost a game yesterday. Like if you looking at this concept of comfort versus destruction, if you wallow in that loss too long, that's what leads to 2 losses and 3 and 4 and on and on. But if you take that and you turn it into something constructive, I mean, I always feel like you can learn so much from a loss, and turn it like, what did we do well? Let's do more of that. What didn't we do well? Let's do less of that. And what can we reasonably do less of? Like there's this, maybe skill and talent cap where you're like, all right, I can't take this person and magically give them the skills of Magic Johnson. That's not going to happen. But if our pick and roll plays work 40% of the time, but I'm only running them 10% of my sets, maybe I should run them 30% of my sets because now I'm going to, maximize the things that we do really, really well. And having that kind of intentional breakdown of what you can learn from these things that aren't going right, or what is going right and doing more of it, I think is where you can really get some value.
I think that's interesting when you watch like over the course of a season, how a team morphs, like coaches go in with, this is what we think our team's going to be really good at. And this is what we think we're capable of at the end of the season. And, like we all do it, as a member of the media, you make predictions on leagues, and now in the Big Ten, when there's 18 teams, you're like, shoot, I have no idea who's going to be 13 versus 12. Like, really? I don't know. But the idea of being willing to do more of what you're good at and less of what you're not good at. Like one example that just comes to mind, being in the women's basketball world, Iowa obviously lost Caitlin Clark, right? And so they lost a significant component of their team chemistry, of their swag, of their offense, of their identity. They were able to go and get a wonderful guard in the transfer portal by the name of Lucy Olson here from Villanova. They're playing similar. They were not having the success. They moved Hannah Stolke, one of their key players up until this point, to the 4 at the beginning of the year. Thought that she'd be better being able to come off the ball screen, use her handle a little bit, really exploit a mismatch. They ran no plays for her. They weren't very successful. Okay, they put her back at the 5, won 5 of the last 6 games. Right? Like, you think you can do something because of the skill set. Not because Hannah Stolke can't come off a ball screen or because she's not talented. Very talented. But it wasn't working. They weren't having the success that they wanted. The staff gets together. What needs to change? Let's look at the analytics. Let's look at the numbers. What does the film tell us? Guys, we'd be silly if we don't do this. And that's a program that has a phenomenal culture. Lisa Bluter worked extremely hard for a number of years to build a phenomenal culture that's been documented. I mean, we can't say anything more about their culture. So the culture was primed and ready for, some might think, a dramatic change. Some, maybe it wasn't a dramatic change, but the culture was ready to make the change that was needed to make, that obviously the coaches and the analytics team thought was the necessary one. And what is the payoff? Different success than the 4 losses that they had in a row, prior. It's just interesting when you're willing to look at the numbers and what is my role? As a coach, my role, I need to call different plays. What I'm calling is not giving us the result that we want. Not because the kids aren't working hard, not because they're not good players, but we're not getting the result. What's my role? My role is play call. Okay, we're going to adjust the play call and do something that the numbers say is positive. So if we're going to bring this back to listeners, what is your role as the coach, and how can you, I think your point was wonderful, John, like, do less of what's not working, get your ego, like Bob's point, get your ego out of the way, do less of what's not working and more of what is working. Like if we go to the Eagles, Jalen Hurts, stop throwing the ball, just keep giving it to Saquon Barkley. Oh, it wasn't his night in New Orleans. Okay, now throw the ball and look what happens, right? Like, and that's a great team in a professional setting that has a lot more mobility, right? But high school teams can do the same thing. It's conversation. It's getting to know your athletes, building rapport and trust, so that if you're like, you know what, we need to make a change in the starting lineup or in our play calls, or who gets the ball in late game situations, but this is what's best for the team, and this is my role as a coach. Like, those are the parts that all go into a very long season, whether you're winning or losing. Like, it's a long, even a BAA season, John, it's going to be long for those little girls.
It sure is. Well, and not to, and I think it's so simple that I think high level coaches often underestimate that simple formula. If it's not working, do less of it, meaning don't stop doing it. Like highest level, did they stop giving the ball to Saquon Barkley? No, they kept giving it to him. The Chiefs were ready to stop him because they had never lost a game this season, the Eagles, when he ran for less than like 130 yards or something like that, right? Like they didn't lose a lot of games, but they didn't win any when Saquon hit that threshold. So they're like, you know what? That's key to victory. We're going to stop that. And so they did. But then Jalen said, I can do other things too. And Sirianni and the guys adjusted. And they figured out what's going to work. And they did more of that. They every now and again give the ball to Saquon. Say, like, let's just see. He might break off a 60. Who knows? We're just going to do less of it because it's not working. We're going to do more of what's working. Last night, coaching these, 7th and 8th graders. We have a great 5. She's a fantastic center, right? We were stifled by a zone, which we hadn't really practiced against. And so we're like, hey, push the ball down. Don't let them get it set up. Get it into our 5. She's bigger than everybody. Make them stop that. And then they started to collapse on her. Kick it out. kick it out to our two. She's got that. And then we did that, right? And so even in the moment, we were saying, this is working, keep doing it, keep doing it. All right, they figured that out. We're going to make a slight change. And so I think the adaptability, either in game, in season, in life, like what is, that's one of the things I know that when I coach, whether it's athletes, whether it's coaches, whether it's business people, every 30 days, do a self-assessment. What's working well for me? Rate myself from 1 to 10. What's working? It's, for those of us who's worked with like Sean O'Brien, that's part of his framework that he does, that I've adapted and used, and do more of what's working, do less of what's not working, and measuring those things though. Like if you don't know your numbers, right? In business, it's my revenue, it's my, points of contact, it's whatever are my numbers that contribute to my business output and success. In coaching, it's what are the things I just did this last night actually. I looked at it, I asked ChatGPT to come up with the metrics that most correlate to success for college teams in high school and college. And that possession, efficiency of offense, and goal differential. So turnovers, winning faceoffs and turnover differential, having efficient shooting and high assisted goals, and defenses holding teams under 10, right? So those are my metrics. So now I can go and say, you want to have 55% face-off percentage, you want to be +5 on turnover margin, 30% shooting, 60% assisted goals, defense hold them under 10. If we can get save percentage at 50, those are our targets. Now we know what to measure. Now we know what good looks like. And so now I can take drills and I can focus on things that directly correlate with those metrics. So I'm not doing this at my 7th, 8th grade BAA basketball, but I'm watching what works well and what work doesn't. Then we're going to practice the stuff. We're going to do more of what works well. We're going to try to, lean into our strengths. But I can take this and I can create like key measurables, KPIs out of this and put them into a practice plan and put them into a game plan in order to know what if I hit this, my likelihood of winning goes way up. And so even in losses, like look at what that is and turn it into targets and measure it. And the whole like sabermetrics and analytics, you brought that up, Maren, is like there was somebody whose job it was, and not all of us have the staffs that Iowa women's basketball has, but I did this in ChatGPT. So you could get an AI tool where you could dump in your statistics and say, tell me what this means to me, right? You don't have to do it all by yourself, even if you don't have a staff, but somebody from the analytics team gave them the information, or they said, hey, go run these numbers. And so like this, we'd be silly not to use things like that to our advantage to understand the things that we can learn, kind of in between the lines, the stuff that's not as easily visible.
And I don't want to step on Bob here, but it comes back to the ego. It comes back to being willing to take a step back and say, I've been on the record publicly, even at a high school level. I've been on the record in front of the booster club or in front of the parents saying, we're going to be this pressing team that does X, Y, and Z. And, you're going to see blah, blah, what you're going to see these numbers from us. It takes you to swallow your ego and be able to say, but that's not how this team is built. And we're going to do this instead. But I think to Bob's point as well, when then it turns out to be the results that all those others are looking for, they don't care how you got there. Yep. They only care when you lose. They don't care how you got there when you win. Whether that's right or wrong, but that's what we have to play into, right? Like we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I would totally agree, Maren. And I think we're getting close to being done here, but I would kind of wrap up what I've had to say today by, and I've listened to you guys over the course of the last 40 minutes or so, and it occurred to me that is there any better metaphor, like, or maybe that's not the right word, but when we talk about how to manage up through the ups and downs of a long season, is that not life? And as coaches, are we not building good humans? Like, I don't care. Take your lacrosse, take your basketball, take your baseball, whatever it is. Are we not charged with just building good people? Because very few are going pro and and doing the whole thing. And so it comes down to, like I always say, much of what I learned about life I learned on the field or on the court. I learned how to lose, and I learned how to win, and I learned how to pick somebody up and get them going. And I learned, and then as a coach, Marin, back to your point, is like, when is the right time to push somebody a little bit harder, or to just throw an arm around them and say, "Come over here a minute, what's going on?" That's the stuff that I remember now as an adult. I remember the coaches, and I remember how they made me feel. And the ones I have the fondest memories of are the ones that had the best interest in mind of everybody on the team. And that, yeah, we're going to do some things this season. Winning and losing is all part of it, but we're going to be better people for it. And we're going to be a team that other people want to be on. And John, I coached the youth stuff too when my daughter was little, and you'll get a kick out of this. I show up at the 4th grade girls basketball, right? I said, ladies, this year we're going to learn how to win, and we're going to learn how to lose, and we're going to learn how to do both gracefully. And I will guarantee you this, the best 5 people, the best 5 players will be on the court in the last minute of the game. And I'm not answering any questions about that. We wanted to win, right? And that's life. And that's, we're trying to win, but we're learning along the way, and we're always a work in progress. So guys, thanks for having me. This has been great. I enjoyed banging around with you guys, and I pick up so much on all these calls. So thanks.
No, that's great. Bob, I would love to end on that note. I don't think there's anything else I could add on top of that. I think you've surmised it perfectly. And so thank you. We'll be back again next month. If you have any questions in between then and now, feel free to reach out to any of us. We look forward to continuing the series with you, and have a wonderful rest of your February. We'll see you back in March.
All right, guys. Thanks.
Take
Appreciate
care,
it.
everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.